In the last episode, we talked about the escalation habit inside growing trucking companies. The pattern where more and more decisions slowly move upward until the owner becomes the bottleneck. Dispatch escalates, payroll escalates, safety escalates, operations escalates, sales escalates. Everything ends up on one desk. That's your desk. But there's an uncomfortable truth behind that pattern. In many cases, the escalation habit doesn't start with the team, it starts with the owner. Because early in the life of the trucking company, the owner is usually the smartest person in the room. They know the customers, they know the lanes, they know the drivers. They've solved almost every problem before. That's often because how the company succeeded in the first place. But that same strength that builds the company early can quietly become the thing that limits it later. It's hard because you're the owner and you just want to be helpful and you've done all these things, but failing to allow your people to make the decisions just cost you in the long run. Welcome to Driven for Success, the podcast where we talk about the systems and decisions that help trucking companies grow without the owner becoming the bottleneck. I'm your host, Mike Ritzema, owner of Superior Trucking Payroll Service. If you run a trucking company somewhere between 20 and 80 trucks, you've probably experienced this stage where people bring you problems because they know you'll have the answer. Today, we're going to talk about why that can become one of the hidden costs of growth. Why does this happen? This pattern usually develops for a very simple reason. It's because you, the owner, are really good at solving problems. Someone brings a question, the owner already knows the answer, so they give it quickly and efficiently. They get to be the hero. Everyone moves on with their day. That works extremely well when the company is small and everybody's in one room. But as the company grows, something subtle begins to happen. People stop working through the problem themselves because they know the owner will solve it later for them. So instead of thinking through the situation, they just bring the problem up to the owner. And that's where the escalation habit we talked about last week begins to really take root. Think about detention pay, again, the example that we've used. Oh, what do we pay that customer? Or what do we charge that customer for detention? Or what do we pay this driver for detention? Instead of having somewhere they can look it up, they just ask the owner. The owner knows the answer and they just give it and everybody goes back on their day. The owner kind of becomes the wiki for the whole company because they know all the information and that's where it all lives. And that's the problem. It just can't live there. It has to be somewhere else. Over time, this creates what I like to call an intelligence bottleneck. All the best thinking inside the company still lives in one place, and that's the owner. Everyone else becomes operators, people who just execute instructions, not people who solve problems, not people who make decisions, not people who come up with creative ways to make the company better, just people who wait for direction. The company may grow, more trucks, more drivers, more office staff, but the thinking capacity of the organization, the intellectual ability of the organization hasn't grown at all. And that eventually becomes the real constraint of growth. It's it's just so hard. They become the owner, you the owner becomes the default problem solver because you know all the answers. And it's great that you know all the answers, but should they be asking you the questions? Is there another way that the operator, that the dispatcher, that the accountant, that the whoever can get the answer themselves and not have to burden you with having to make another decision and making you feel responsible to own all this information? So I think that's really the key is it's one thing to know it, it's another thing to have to be the only person that knows it. That's where the hard part is. Let me give you an example. I once talked to a fleet owner who felt like he had to solve every single operational problem himself. It didn't matter if it was a dispatch issue or a driver issue or a customer problem or an accounting problem, any of those things. Every one of those landed on his desk. But when we started to look at what was happening, something became clear. Whenever someone brought him a problem, he would answer it immediately, 5 seconds, 10 seconds. He was fast, he was decisive, and he was usually right. Almost always he was right. But something he was accidentally teaching his team was don't spend time thinking about it. The owner will figure it out. And that's how the intelligence bottlenecks form. And it usually comes from a good place. It comes from wanting to move the company forward. It comes from, what you have the right answer. I think of it like Jeopardy. You want to buzz in right away. Give them, in that case, it'd be the question for Jeopardy, but you want to give the correct answer to guide your team to do the best work they can do. All those things are great. But when it's you always having to guide them and you can't teach them to be self guided, that's where things really get sideways. And that's where you start having all these intelligence bottlenecks. And that's where growth dies, really. So there's a long term cost to all of this. Eventually, the company reaches a point where it becomes just exhausting for everyone. The owner becomes responsible for solving nearly every meaningful problem, even though they've hired people, and the team that they've hired is capable, but the owner never developed other problem solvers. They never taught anybody how to solve their own problem. That's when the owner starts to feel overwhelmed. They also feel that did they hire the right staff? These guys can't solve their own problems. Well, they have to be shown how to do it. So this is all true, but it's not because the company is failing, but it's because the company is still depending on one singular brain, the owners, to keep everything moving forward. The owner is trying to be strategic. They're trying to think about plans for should I buy these trucks or buy those trucks or when should I buy them? Those are big decisions. Five trucks is $1 million decision, but they can't get their head around it because every 2 minutes someone's knocking on their door. Hey, does Jim get detention for this load? Hey, what do we charge this customer for this thing? Hey, quick question. That's always the fatal beginning of the problem there. Hey, quick question. What should we do about this? And he's got $1 million decision to make, and instead he's stuck in the $20 decision. You've got people for that. So let me ask you a question. When someone brings you a problem, how often do you answer it immediately? And how often do you ask them to think about what the solution should be? Just that small difference changes how people think inside your company. Think back to the last few questions you've had given to you. Were you able to say to them, what do you think the answer should be? It really at least will, even if it's the wrong answer, at least you're getting them thinking about the problem and you're getting them to come up with an answer. And that can be really powerful. If they're resistant to do it, another little trick that I learned was someone knocks on your door, says, "Hey, quick question." Just say, "Hey, can you come back in 5 minutes?" And in that 5 minutes, they might solve the problem themselves, or they might come back with a better answer. At least when they come, if they come back in 5 minutes, which 90% of the time they might not, they'll have a more thought out answer for you. And also, you'll be training them if you ask them they think the answer should be. They're going to know when they start saying, "Hey, quick question," that they better have an answer ready as well, what they think it should be. And if they're wrong, it's just training, which is what you want anyway. You want to train them to make the right answers. And if they're making the right answer, then you can teach them not to bother you with it. At some point, the owner has to make a shift. Instead of being the fastest answer in the room, the fastest gun in the West, they become the person who develops other problem solvers. When someone brings a problem, the first response becomes a question. Well, what do you think we should do? Sometimes the answer is going to be incomplete and sometimes it'll need an adjustment. But something important is happening because people are now coming into you with answers. They begin to take ownership of the decision that they're bringing to you that they want you to make now. They'll be better prepared to make it themselves. And gradually, the company builds more than one brain. It builds a team capable of solving problems together. So as we talked about, someone comes in with again, it's been the example I've been using, a detention pay issue. Do we pay this driver for the detention on this load? Well, you can kind of just give them your thought process on it. First, you can say, "What do you think we should do?" And they'll say, "I think we should or shouldn't pay them." And then you can ask them the questions that you would ask to determine the answer. You can say, "Well, what time was their appointment?" "Well, their appointment was at 11 a.m." "Okay. What, did they arrive on time?" "Yes, they were there at 10:30. Okay, how long were they there? They were there till 2:30. Okay, well, that's 3.5 hours from the appointment timeout. What's our policy on paying detention? Well, it's over 3 hours, they get paid. Okay, so was 3.5 hours over 3 hours? Yes. Okay, then they get paid by the schedule that we've set up versus, oh, I don't versus just giving them the answer or you just knowing all the loads because that's exhausting too. So give them your thought process and you'll teach them to think and make the decision the way that you make the decision. And then once you've done this a couple of times, they're going to come to you and say, "Hey, does this guy get detention? His appointment was at 11. He was there at 10:30. He got empty at 2:30. So I think he should get it." Okay, well, good. And then at that point, it's just a policy for everybody. Look, this is what I'm going to ask. This is what you need to bring me, and the answer is already going to be apparent. Here's one thing to try this week. The next time someone brings you a problem, and it probably won't be long, just pause before answering and ask one simple question. What do you think we should do? And then listen to their reasoning. Make them reason it out. Don't just let them give you an answer. You might still guide the final decision. You might make some changes. You might approve it. We don't know. We'll find out. There's only one way to find out, and we're going to know. But that moment forces them to think. And that's how companies begin to turn employees into problem solvers instead of escalators. So your team is going to have questions. I mean, they're going to have questions even if when you do all this, but they'll have less. But you hired them to come up with answers. There's no shortage of questions. You want people with answers. So you got to teach them how to answer the question. And when you do that, you're really going to see how that works. And the way you get answers from them is to ask them questions and walk them through your thinking. And don't just give them the answer of, yes, we're going to pay attention on that load, on that driver, or whatever the question is. Walk them through how you got there, and not just by telling them how you got there, but ask them the questions that you ask yourself in your head. Now, you ask yourself these questions so quickly, it's almost reflexive, but just kind of slow it down and walk through the process with them. And then the employees will start giving you the answers instead, and then they'll stop asking you the questions, especially when you do the thing from the previous few episodes where we talk about making a policy. The policy makes itself because it's just your questions down the line. Being the smartest person in the room is often what builds a successful trucking company from being small to being mid-sized and beyond. But if that pattern never changes, the company eventually becomes limited by one person's thinking capacity. Great companies make a different shift. The owner stops being the only brain in the room and starts building a team that can think, decide, and solve problems together without the owner. Because companies that truly scale are not the ones with the smartest owner. They're the ones where thinking spreads through the entire organization. If this feels like you, just know you can do it. If you think about other trucking companies that are really big, think of your mega carriers. There's not one person who's touching every load and making every decision about pay or safety. They have standards and they just communicate those standards. And you can do that. You know what they are in your head because you're answering these questions so quickly. So you know the answer. It's just sharing with them the process of getting to the answer the way that you want it done. And then you won't have to solve every problem yourself. And you can go back to being that company you thought you were going to be when you were 40 trucks or 50 trucks, when you were 5 or 10 trucks and you were dreaming of having this many trucks and thinking people were going to make decisions for themselves and you were going to hire capable people. And you probably did hire capable people, but now you can empower them to make their own decisions and give them a toolkit to do it with. And your life will just be so much better and you can go take that vacation that you deserve. Thanks for listening to Driven for Success. If you found this to be helpful, please give us a like and subscribe. It really helps other trucking companies just like you be able to benefit from this information. We do this out of love for the trucking community. At Superior Trucking Payroll Service, our mission is to help trucking families, and this is one of the ways that we do it. So thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.